right, folks. So just really briefly, I'll let you know what we're going to be talking about is we are going to look at the historical perspective because it's important to understand context. And with that, I just want to say that some of that material that I will share with you is really uncomfortable. Some of the language that I will use is really uncomfortable to hear. And as always, whenever I'm delivering any kind of presentations around race, there is no shame or blame implied in any of what I'm going to share with you. This is factual information that helps us understand context, helps us understand where we are now, and how it's actually impacting on the people that we work with. So I just wanted to start, the historical perspective. Again, this was something that was taught to me by Professor Richard Drayton at King's College London, who is probably one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. If you ever come across him, please watch whatever he has to say. It's fascinating. And the way that he describes history is that we have fast history, which we often learn in school, right? We learn, well, what was the date, and then that happened, and then what was the date, and that happened, and we know the timeline, and we know everything that's kind of occurring within those things. So fast history just looks at dates, timelines, and events. It's not very often, however, that we focus on the slow history, okay, which he calls the slow history, and that's about what was the psychology that came out of those events? What was the sociological impact of those events? How did that shape ideology going forward? And how did that influence economy as well? We don't often talk about that when we're learning about history, but it is essential for us to understand. And very often when we talk about race, people are like, that was 200 years ago, that was so many years ago, why is it still important? It's important because of this, but it's important because it impacted on our slow history. So when we look, for example, at, again, I'm just going to give you a content warning. I'm going to read you some content about that was around at the time in the 1600s. Okay, so it's really uncomfortable. You have moved a long way away from using this kind of language. But again, this is about understanding context. So please bear with me. Any of my Black and brown siblings that are on the call, just look after yourselves. This is just, again, sharing the information that was around at the time and how it shaped ideology. So when we go back to Tudor times, so this was around 1485 to 1603, Black people or people of color actually lived as free individuals in England, right? So many of them arrived through trade with countries like Morocco. And during this period, the concept of free soil was prevalent in the 16th century England. This idea held that anyone who set foot on English soil became free. Okay, and a notable court case in 1659 concluded that England had too pure an air for slaves to breathe in. So before 1607, England had no colonies, so most enslaved Africans were transported by the Spanish and Portuguese merchants. However, during wars with Spain and Portugal, English warships recruited enslaved people from enemy ports, and some of those individuals then found freedom in England. So most Black people in Tudor England were not enslaved. Instead, they worked as servants or tradespeople engaging in various professions such as carpentry, needlemakers, and silk weavers, for example. So what changed, right? What changed that language and that ideology? In many cases, we think of this as the Barbados Slave Code in 1661 started using language that we kind of can recognize today when we think about racism, right? And one of the earliest references to the new ideas of that concept, we often hear about race as a social construct. It is. Somebody came up with the idea, right? And the first kind of idea of this was referenced in 1640, where a scientific observer made a differentiation between Dutch, English, and Portuguese people and referred to them as Europeans versus the indigenous and African enslaved people, kind of made that segregation in terms of their humanity, right? And it's also important, folks, and we hear this a lot when we talk about slavery in the context of this, is that slavery existed for thousands of years. The difference is that very often, uncomfortably, they were the spoils of war, right? So even when African nations sold other Africans into slavery, they were still seen as humans amongst each other. Chattel slavery, however, was invented by colonizers in those different countries to reconcile their deep religiosity with the brutality of what they were doing to Black and Brown people. Because if we are very religious and pious people, then how do we reconcile that with how we're treating these humans so they're not human anymore? Right? Then that starts to make sense because the cognitive dissonance was too big. So the Barbados Slave Code was something, and again, here we go with the uncomfortable language. Okay, so stick with me, folks. So this was described as an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes. And this language is interesting because it suggests that this group is a homogenous group, right? That they need to be ordered and that they need to be governed, right, by somebody else. And several ideas were then generated at the time to support the idea of the enslavement of African peoples. So Europeans saw African people as a homogenous group, and they were seen as more suited to work on plantations. It was argued that captive African people would potentially be executed if the slave trade was abolished. So they thought that enslaved people actually benefited from this. And we kind of see that in that white savior kind of complex. Yeah. So there followed this movement of scientific racism, which supported these ideologies. Yeah, so it was pseudoscience stating that Black people, for example, were predisposed to disease and designed for extinction, completely obviously ignoring their lived experience. But it also gave rise to the excuse and the reasonableness in the time of thinking of using Black bodies for scientific research, including gynecology, for example. So James Marion Sims is the father of modern gynecology as we know it. But everything he learned that we now know about, for example, cesarean sections, forceps deliveries, all of those things, he practiced those on Black enslaved women without the benefit of pain relief because they felt that Black people didn't feel pain in the same way that white people do, right? Side note, still today in the UK, more Black and brown women die in childbirth than white women due to the lack of giving pain medications and not being taken seriously, right? So it matters, this stuff. So this is kind of how it entrenched that racism. So again, language awful. Stay with me. So they said that in this code that Negroes were heathenish, brutish, and an uncertain, dangerous pride of people who required extraordinary punishary laws for the benefit and good of the colony. Now, I want you to think about how we speak about young people, Black young people still today. How sometimes when we see reports of Serena Williams, for example, and her body, how it was described by the media at the time. Yeah. So this was, again, the first piece of legislation which correlated different kinds of legal status and protections with race. Yeah. So, and this was signatured by skin color. So it was the model for all slave laws in the British Empire after that. So race, religion, and property are the key basis for other rights. So we had distinct categories, right? So those with rights were white, pious landowners. And then those without those rights were women, children, slaves, and animals. Yeah, in one. How's everybody doing? Is everybody okay? I know this is uncomfortable. Okay. It's going to get worse. Sorry. All right. So this man is called Carl Linnaeus, and he was a Swedish biologist. And he was the first to frame principles for defining like natural genera and species of organisms and to create a uniform system for naming them, right? So we know that like different species have different names and then they categorize them within that species. So genus and species. But so and that's the reasons why a fox is called a vulpus vulpus or a lion is called a panthero leo. So the species panthero, the genus Leo. Okay. Unfortunately, and very creepily, he also classified humans. Okay, so this was in the 1760s. This was okay. Uncomfortable, stay with me. He identified Americans, and so we're meaning here the native indigenous population of the Americas, red, unyielding, cheerful, and free. Europeans were white, muscular, light, wise, and inventive. Asiatians, slow, stiff, stern, haughty, and greedy. And Africans, black, lazy, sly, sluggish, and neglectful. Okay. So this is 1760s, and we're still hearing kind of echoes of that language sometimes from racist ideologies that are kind of popular today. So it's really important, as uncomfortable as that was, and thank you for sticking with me, that we recognize that this comes from somewhere. Yeah, this comes into a lot of research that was done at the time, scientific research. You have the use of Black and brown bodies in museums, yeah, that we learn from. Literature, movies, all of this kind of built on this ideology at the time that we're trying to kind of break down now. So if we fast forward to the modern age, and especially when we're kind of then looking into sports, for example, Black and brown athletes still faced significant barriers to entry to sports due to racial discrimination and exclusion from clubs and competitions, especially like before First World War and certainly after. We had issues around prejudice and stereotyping as well. They often encountered that prejudice and stereotyping, which then affected their opportunities and the recognition that they kind of deserved for their sporting prowess. There was also limited representation because of that. So, you know, we say that to young people a lot, right? If you can see it, you can be it. And that was very, very difficult. So it really was about kind of breaking through all of this. And then the reasons for those exclusions were that colonial legacy, that colonial language that happened at the time, that kind of, you know, even impacted on our economy in lots of different ways. But I won't get into it. I know we have short time. So we also talk about institutional racism then, because if we understand that colonialism impacted on how Western society views Black and brown people, if we understand that that contributes to unconscious bias that we have today, and that everybody can be a part of that, institutions are created by people. So it's actually quite inevitable that that would flow forth into institutionalized racism. And then, of course, we have social barriers as well. And in many ways, folks, we've come a really long way. In many ways, we've still got a way to go, right? Because there is that marginalization. So what does that kind of mean for us? And it's just important that we recognize that the rise of that ideology that I talked about and the language has influenced how we think of Black and brown people in Western society today, because it influenced scientific research, it influenced literature, and it reference in education. And it's important because of the way the brain works, right? If we get a message often enough, we assume it's the way it is.